28 minutes past midnight, 17th of May, 1943. A Lancaster bomber designated AJG is flying at 60 feet above the Möhne reservoir in Germany's Ruhr Valley. Two spotlights mounted beneath the aircraft cast beams onto the black water below. Where those beams converge into a single point of light, the navigator knows they are at precisely the right altitude. Any higher and the weapon will not work. Any lower and 30 tons of aircraft will meet the surface at 230 miles per hour. Beneath the fuselage, where the bomb bay doors have been removed entirely, a cylinder the size of an oil drum is spinning at 500 revolutions per minute. The anti-aircraft guns on the dam's towers are firing tracer rounds across the water. Wing Commander Guy Gibson holds his course steady. He is 24 years old and has already flown more than 170 combat missions. By any reasonable measure, he should have been dead several times over by now. The weapon he is about to release weighs 9,000 pounds. It has no official name yet, just a code name. 6 months earlier, the man who designed it was bouncing glass marbles across a tin bathtub in his garden in Surrey. Barnes Wallis was not, by any stretch of imagination, the sort of man you would expect to find throwing marbles into bathtubs. By 1942, he was one of the most respected aircraft engineers in Britain. His geodetic airframe design, a lattice of interwoven duralumin beams that looked rather like a wicker basket, had made the Vickers Wellington the most survivable bomber in the Royal Air Force. Wellingtons came back from missions over Germany, with holes in the fuselage large enough to climb through. The structure simply refused to fail. More than 11,000 would be built before the war ended, a record for any British multi-engine aircraft. Wallis was 54 years old, quiet, methodical, and had been a vegetarian for years. He lived in a house called White Hill in Effingham, Surrey, with his wife Molly and their 4 children. Photographs from the period show a thin man with spectacles and white hair, the sort of person you might mistake for a country solicitor or a retired schoolmaster. He did not look like someone about to propose one of the most audacious weapons of the war. But Wallis had a habit of solving problems that other engineers considered impossible, and in 1942 he had become rather obsessed with German dams. The Ruhr Valley was the industrial engine of Nazi Germany. Its steel mills and armaments factories depended on a network of dams for everything: water for the manufacturing process, hydroelectric power for the furnaces, and controlled water levels in the canals that carried coal to the plants. Cut the water supply and the engine would stall. The Möhne Dam was the largest of them. When it was completed in 1913, it was the biggest in Europe. 134 million cubic meters of water held back by a wall of limestone and concrete, 34 meters thick at its base. The Germans knew perfectly well what a tempting target it made. They had strung torpedo nets across the reservoir and mounted anti-aircraft guns on the towers. The Air Ministry had been studying the Ruhr dams since 1937. The problem was straightforward. No bomb in existence could breach a wall that thick. A direct hit from a conventional high-explosive bomb would barely scratch it. The dams were, for all practical purposes, indestructible. Wallis thought otherwise. He began with basic physics. A bomb exploding on the surface of a reservoir would waste most of its energy blasting water and air upward. Impressive to look at, but largely useless against a dam. However, a charge detonated underwater, pressed directly against the face of the wall, would be an entirely different matter. Water does not compress. It would transmit the full force of the explosion straight into the concrete. The difficulty was delivery. The torpedo nets stretched across the reservoir would stop any conventional underwater weapon long before it reached the dam. Wallis needed something that could travel across the surface, skip over the nets, and somehow end up against the wall. The answer came from a memory most English children share: skipping stones across a pond. If a bomb could be made to bounce across the water like a flat pebble, it would clear the defences entirely. Wallis began experimenting in his garden with a tin bathtub and his daughter's glass marbles, firing them from a makeshift catapult. The neighbours must have wondered. The marbles skipped beautifully. He moved to the National Physical Laboratory for more rigorous tests. In July 1942, 280 pounds of explosive were detonated against a disused dam called Nunty Grow in Wales. The centre of the structure was blown clean out. A colleague named George Edwards, who happened to be a keen cricketer, suggested the critical refinement. If the bomb were given backspin before release, like a well-bowled delivery, it would stabilize in flight and, more importantly, crawl down the face of the dam after impact rather than bouncing away. The final design called for a 9,000-pound cylinder, spinning at 500 revolutions per minute. Wallis had his weapon. Now he needed to convince the men who could authorize its use. They were not, as it turned out, entirely enthusiastic. On the 14th of February 1943, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, received a memorandum about the bouncing bomb project. Harris was not a man given to diplomatic hedging. He scrawled his assessment in the margin. This was tripe of the wildest description, and there was not the smallest chance of it working. Harris was not being foolish. The new Lancaster bombers were only just entering service in sufficient numbers, and he was preparing a strategic bombing campaign against German cities that he believed would win the war. Every aircraft mattered. Every crew mattered. The idea of diverting 30 of his precious Lancasters for a weapon that had been tested with marbles in a bathtub struck him as, at best, a distraction. At worst, a criminal waste of machines and trained men he could not afford to lose on what amounted to a scientific experiment. There was also the matter of Wallis himself. Harris had met enthusiasts before, men with pet theories and wonder weapons that would supposedly end the war by Thursday. The Air Ministry corridors were full of them. Most of their schemes came to nothing. A middle-aged engineer who wanted to skip bombs across water like a child skipping stones did not, on the face of it, seem obviously different from the rest. Harris had a war to fight with weapons that actually existed. The chairman of Vickers, Sir Charles Craven, summoned Wallis to London shortly afterward. Craven had been receiving pointed inquiries from the Air Ministry about his employees' peculiar hobby. The company had government contracts to fulfill, aircraft to build, and a reputation to maintain. Craven did not appreciate one of his senior designers attracting the wrong sort of attention from people who could make life difficult. He told Wallis bluntly that he was making a damn nuisance of himself and should drop the whole idea immediately. The project was to be abandoned. There would be no further discussion. Wallis, who was not a man given to confrontation, sat quietly for a moment. Then he offered his resignation. If he could not serve the best interests of the company and the country, he said, perhaps it would be better if he left. Craven, who had expected compliance rather than principle, was somewhat taken aback. The meeting ended without resolution. Wallis returned to Surrey, uncertain whether he still had a job or a project. But Wallis had allies he did not know about. Group Captain Frederick Winterbotham, an intelligence officer with connections in high places, had been following the project with considerable interest. He understood, perhaps better than most, what a blow to German industrial capacity a successful attack on the Ruhr dams might deliver. He ensured that the test films from Chesil Beach reached Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, and the one man in the Royal Air Force who outranked Harris. Portal watched the footage of prototype spheres skipping across the water in long, graceful arcs. He asked questions. He requested the technical reports. He consulted with scientists whose judgment he trusted. Unlike Harris, he was convinced. He was. On the 26th of February, Portal overruled his Bomber Command chief directly. 30 Lancasters were allocated to the mission. Harris was furious, but he was also a professional. Orders were orders. If the operation was going forward, it would be done properly, whatever his personal reservations. There was, however, a catch that made the whole enterprise even more improbable. The dams would only be full enough for maximum destructive effect in May, when the spring rains had raised the water levels to their peak. Attack too early, and a breach would release less water, causing less damage downstream. Wait too long, and the levels would begin to drop as summer drew the moisture away. The window was narrow, perhaps 2 weeks at most. That gave Wallis 8 weeks to finalize a weapon that existed largely on paper, modify aircraft that had never been designed to carry anything of the sort, and train crews for a mission unlike anything previously attempted in the history of aerial warfare. 8 weeks. In that time, the bomb would need to move from prototype to production. The spherical casing was still shattering on impact during tests, a problem Wallis had not yet solved. The Lancasters would need their bomb bay doors removed entirely and replaced with special mounting gear that did not yet exist. Mechanisms to spin the weapon before release would need to be designed, built, and installed. Crews would need to learn to fly at 60 feet above water in the dark, a height at which the slightest error meant a high-speed collision with the surface. And somehow, all of this would need to happen in absolute secrecy. If the Germans learned what was coming, they would reinforce the dams or drain the reservoirs, and the entire effort would be wasted. It was, by any reasonable assessment, impossible. Wallis set to work. On the 21st of March 1943, a new squadron was formed at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. It had no number yet, just a placeholder designation, Squadron X. The men arriving at the base knew only that they had been selected for a special operation of some kind. The details remained classified, even to them. This was not unusual in wartime, but the level of secrecy surrounding their posting was remarkable even by the standards of Bomber Command. Scampton was a pre-war station with permanent brick buildings rather than the Nissen huts that housed most bomber crews. The men arriving found themselves in relative comfort, which only added to the sense that something out of the ordinary was being planned. Comfortable billets usually meant dangerous work ahead. The Royal Air Force did not go to such trouble for routine operations. The commanding officer was Wing Commander Guy Gibson. He was not a large man physically, but he had a presence that filled rooms. He held the Distinguished Service Order with bar and the Distinguished Flying Cross with bar, decorations that spoke to a combat record few could match. His uniform tunic carried the ribbon of every major campaign honour available to a bomber pilot at that point in the war. One of his bomb aimers, Johnny Johnson, would later describe him with characteristic RAF understatement. A little man with quite a big opinion of himself, but he had done an awful lot more than the rest of us. Gibson was not universally loved by his men. He could be cold, demanding, and impatient with anything less than perfection. He had little tolerance for excuses, and none at all for what he considered slackness. But he was universally respected, and in a combat squadron, that was what mattered. The men knew that Gibson would never ask them to do anything he would not do himself. He had proven that over more missions than most of them could imagine surviving. Gibson had been given authority to handpick his crews from across the whole of 5 Group, Bomber Command's most experienced Lancaster formation. This was an extraordinary privilege. Squadron commanders typically worked with whatever personnel were assigned to them. Gibson, by contrast, could telephone any station in the group and simply request the men he wanted. He chose carefully, studying combat records and consulting with other commanding officers. He selected men with experience in low-level flying and a reputation for steadiness under pressure. Pilots who could hold an aircraft rock steady in turbulence. Navigators who could find a target in the dark without electronic aids. Bomb aimers with a record of accuracy. By the end of March, 133 aircrew had assembled at Scampton, organised into 21 Lancaster crews. They came from across the Commonwealth and beyond. Britons formed the majority, but there were substantial contingents from Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The Royal Air Force in 1943 was an imperial enterprise, drawing men from every corner of the globe where the King's writ ran. Among the Canadians was an American named Joe McCarthy. He had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before Pearl Harbor because he wanted to fight and his own country was not yet ready to enter the war. McCarthy was built like a prize fighter and flew with a relaxed aggression that his crews found reassuring. He would become one of the most reliable pilots in the squadron, though he did not know it yet. The men trained hard through the final days of March and into April. They flew low-level exercises over the English countryside, skimming across lakes and reservoirs at heights that would have been considered reckless in peacetime. They practiced night navigation without the usual electronic aids, finding their way by moonlight and map reading alone. They grew accustomed to flying their heavy 4-engine bombers at altitudes where a moment's inattention meant collision with the ground. None of them knew what they were training for. Speculation was inevitable, and rumours circulated through the mess halls and crew rooms. Some thought they were preparing to attack the Tirpitz, the German battleship hiding in the Norwegian fjords. Others guessed at U-boat pens or secret weapons facilities. A few came close to the truth, but nobody knew for certain. The target remained a secret held by a very small number of people. Gibson himself had only the broadest outline of the plan. He had met Wallis at the Vickers facility and seen films of the weapon in testing, but he did not yet know which dams would be attacked or precisely how the operation would unfold. That information would come later, closer to the date. For now, his job was to forge 133 men from different squadrons, different countries and different backgrounds into a single cohesive unit, capable of executing the most demanding mission Bomber Command had ever attempted. Wallis, meanwhile, was still working on the weapon itself. The spherical casing continued to shatter on impact during tests, and he was running out of time to solve the problem. 8 weeks had seemed impossibly short when Portal gave his approval. Now the days were slipping away faster than anyone had anticipated. The technical requirements for dropping Wallis's weapon were unlike anything Bomber Command had attempted before. 3 parameters had to converge at the precise moment of release: altitude exactly 60 feet above the water, airspeed 232 miles per hour, distance 450 yards from the dam face. All of this at night, over a surface that offered no visual references, while anti-aircraft guns filled the air with tracer fire. An error of 10 feet in altitude, and the bomb would either shatter on impact or skip over the dam entirely. Too fast or too slow, and the spacing of the bounces would be wrong. Too close or too far, and the weapon would miss the target altogether. The altitude problem seemed almost unsolvable at first. Barometric altimeters, standard equipment in every aircraft, measured air pressure to calculate height above sea level. They were adequate for cruising at 15,000 feet, where an error of 50 feet made no difference. At 60 feet, they were worthless. The instruments simply could not respond fast enough to the rapid changes in pressure at such low altitude, and the margin for error was essentially zero. A pilot relying on his altimeter at 60 feet over water at night would almost certainly fly into the surface before the needle had time to move. The solution came from Benjamin Lockspizer at the Ministry of Aircraft Production. His idea was elegantly simple. 2 Aldi's lamps would be mounted under each Lancaster, one in the nose and one in the tail, angled inward so that their beams converged at exactly 60 feet below the aircraft. The navigator, looking down through the blister window, would see 2 separate spots of light on the water when the aircraft was too high. As the pilot descended, the spots would move closer together. When they merged into a single figure-8 pattern, the aircraft was at precisely 60 feet. The navigator would call out corrections to the pilot. Down, down, steady. It was the kind of solution that seemed obvious only after someone had thought of it. The popular legend, repeated in countless accounts and dramatized in the 1955 film, credits Gibson himself with the idea after watching a theatrical performance where spotlights converged on stage. This makes for a compelling story, but appears to have no basis in fact. The spotlight system was developed through official channels at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and Lockspizer's contribution is documented in contemporary records. The truth is often less romantic than the myth, but no less ingenious. The distance problem required an even simpler solution. The Möhne Dam had 2 towers at its ends, and the distance between them was known precisely from reconnaissance photographs. Someone, the records do not clearly establish who, devised a handheld wooden sight that resembled a large Y-shaped catapult. 2 nails were driven into the arms of the Y at a specific spacing. The bomb aimer would hold the sight to his eye and watch the dam towers through it. When the towers aligned exactly with the 2 nails, the aircraft was 450 yards from the target. Release the bomb at that instant. It was absurdly primitive for an operation of such sophistication. Wallis had designed a 9,000-pound rotating cylinder that had to be spun to 500 revolutions per minute and dropped with split-second precision. The aircraft had been modified with complex equipment to achieve this, and the final release distance was calculated using a piece of wood and 2 nails that cost perhaps 6pence to manufacture. But it worked, and in wartime that was all that mattered. The crews trained over the Derwent Reservoir in Derbyshire, chosen because its stone towers bore a resemblance to the Möhne Dam's architecture. Night after night through April and into May, the Lancasters thundered across the water at impossibly low altitude, their spotlight beams dancing on the surface below. Local residents grew accustomed to the sound of heavy bombers roaring overhead in the darkness, though they had no idea what was being practiced. The reservoir had been closed to the public, and police patrols ensured that no curious observers got too close. The pilots learned to trust the spotlight system, even when every instinct screamed that they were about to hit the water. The navigators learned to read the converging light spots instantly and call corrections without hesitation. The bomb aimers learned to hold the wooden sight steady and judge the precise moment of release. They flew the same approach dozens of times until the sequence became automatic, until each man could perform his role without conscious thought. That was the standard Gibson demanded. The real attack would be flown under fire, with exhaustion and fear degrading their performance. They had to be so practiced that they could execute the bombing run even when everything else was going wrong. By early May, the crews of Squadron X, now officially designated 617 Squadron, could consistently hit their practice targets. The question remained whether the weapon itself would work when dropped in anger against a real dam defended by real guns. That question would be answered very soon. At 28 minutes past 9 on the evening of Sunday the 16th of May, 1943, the first Lancasters began rolling down the runway at Scampton. The weather was clear, with good visibility, and a nearly full moon that would illuminate the targets. It was the last suitable night before the moon began to wane, and Wallis's weapon had only been successfully tested days earlier. There was no margin left in the schedule. If the raid did not happen tonight, it might not happen at all. The aircraft departed in 3 waves. The first formation of 9 Lancasters, led by Gibson himself, would attack the Möhne Dam as the primary target. If they had bombs remaining after breaching it, they would proceed to the Eder. A second wave of 5 aircraft took a more northerly route toward the Sorpe Dam, which presented different challenges due to its earth and concrete construction. A third wave of 5 aircraft would serve as a mobile reserve, to be directed to whichever target needed additional attacks. The flight plan took them across the North Sea at extremely low altitude to avoid German radar detection, then over the occupied Netherlands and into the heart of the Ruhr industrial region, 100 feet above the ground at night, navigating by moonlight and dead reckoning. The margin for error was measured in seconds. A moment's inattention, a slight miscalculation, and a 30-ton aircraft would plough into the earth at 200 miles per hour. The second wave ran into trouble almost immediately. Flight Lieutenant Munro's Lancaster was hit by flak over the Dutch coast, destroying his radio equipment. Without communications, he could not coordinate with other aircraft or receive target updates. He turned back. Pilot Officer Byers flew into the sea. Cause unknown. Pilot Officer Rice struck the water while flying too low, tearing off his bomb. He nursed his damaged aircraft home. Of the 5 Lancasters sent to the Sorpe, only 2 would reach the target. The first wave fared better, but not without cost. Flight Lieutenant Astel hit an electricity pylon in Germany and crashed with no survivors. The remaining 8 aircraft pressed on toward the Möhne. Gibson reached the target area shortly after midnight and spent several minutes circling the dam, studying the defences. The anti-aircraft positions were clearly visible, their crews alert and waiting. The towers at each end of the dam housed light flak guns that could pour fire directly into the approach path of any attacking aircraft. There was no way to avoid them. The bombers would have to fly straight down the gun barrels. At 28 minutes past midnight, Gibson began his attack run. His Lancaster descended to 60 feet over the reservoir, the spotlight beams converging on the water below. The dam grew larger in the windscreen. Tracer fire rose to meet him. At 450 yards, the bomb aimer released the weapon. It fell away, spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, struck the water, and began to skip toward the dam. 3 bounces, 4, then it struck the wall and sank. Seconds later, an enormous column of water erupted into the night sky, rising hundreds of feet above the dam. When it subsided, the structure was still standing. The massive concrete wall had absorbed the blow. Flight Lieutenant Hopgood went next. His Lancaster had already been hit by flak on the approach, and one engine was trailing smoke. He held his course, descending to 60 feet, but the damage had affected his speed or altitude. The bomb was released a fraction of a second late. It bounced over the dam and exploded on the power station below, destroying it completely. Hopgood's aircraft, now fully ablaze, began to climb. 2 members of his crew managed to bail out before the Lancaster exploded. Hopgood and the remaining 4 men were gone. Flight Lieutenant Martin made the third attack. His bomb struck the water correctly and bounced toward the dam, but veered slightly left and exploded against the shoreline without hitting the wall. No visible damage. Squadron Leader Young followed. His approach was textbook, the bomb release precisely timed. The weapon struck the dam squarely and detonated against the wall. When the water subsided, observers thought they could see crumbling at the crown of the dam, but in the darkness it was impossible to be certain. Flight Lieutenant Maltby began his run. As he descended toward the reservoir, he could see something had changed. Water was spilling over the top of the dam where none had been before. Young's bomb had weakened the structure. Maltby's weapon struck home, and this time there was no doubt. The centre of the Möhne Dam began to collapse. 56 minutes past midnight, a wall of water 134 million cubic metres strong began to pour through a breach 76 metres wide, thundering down the valley toward the sleeping villages below. Gibson ordered the remaining aircraft to form up and proceed to the secondary target. The Eder Dam lay 60 miles to the southeast, in a steep-sided valley that made the Möhne approach look simple by comparison. Aircraft would have to dive over a hilltop, level out over the reservoir, and drop their bombs while flying toward a dam nestled at the base of wooded slopes. There was almost no room for error and no opportunity for a second attempt if the first approach went wrong. Flight Lieutenant Shannon arrived first and began his attack run. The approach was even more difficult than expected. He pulled up at the last moment, unsatisfied with his alignment. A second attempt, same result. A third, fourth, fifth. On his sixth approach, Shannon finally released his weapon. It bounced correctly and struck the dam. No breach. Squadron leader Maudsley attacked next. Something went wrong. His bomb was released late, or perhaps the altitude was incorrect. It struck the parapet of the dam just as his aircraft passed overhead. The explosion caught his Lancaster, damaging it severely. Maudsley's voice came over the radio, weak and broken, confirming he had been hit. He tried to nurse his crippled aircraft home, but was shot down by flak near the German border. No survivors. Pilot Officer Knight made the final attack on the Eder. His bomb hit the dam perfectly, and this time the structure gave way. At 52 minutes past 1 in the morning, the Eder was breached. 2 of the 3 primary targets had been destroyed. The Sorpe remained. Flight Lieutenant McCarthy, the American who had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before his country entered the war, had reached the dam despite the losses suffered by his wave. But the Sorpe was a different type of construction, an earthen embankment with a concrete core rather than a solid masonry wall. Wallis's bouncing bomb had not been designed for this target. The attack required flying along the length of the dam rather than toward it, dropping the bomb directly onto the crest without the benefit of skipping. McCarthy made his run and placed his weapon accurately. It exploded, gouging a crater in the earth, but the dam held. A later aircraft from the reserve wave added another bomb. Still the Sorpe stood. It would survive the night intact. By 3 in the morning, the surviving Lancasters were heading home across occupied Europe, racing the coming dawn. Behind them, 2 valleys were flooding, and the industrial heart of Germany was about to receive a blow it had never anticipated. Of the 19 Lancasters that had taken off from Scampton, 11 returned. 8 aircraft and 53 men were gone. 3 more had been taken prisoner. In a single night, 617 Squadron had lost 40% of its strength. The men who landed back at Scampton in the grey morning light were exhausted beyond words. Some sat in their cockpits for long minutes, unable to summon the energy to climb out. Others walked across the tarmac in silence, past the empty dispersal points where aircraft should have been waiting. The ground crews counted the returning bombers and did the arithmetic themselves. Everyone knew someone who had not come back. But the aircrew were not the only casualties of that night. 330 million tons of water had poured through the breaches in the Möhne and Eder dams. The flood wave reached 10 meters in height, traveling down the valleys at 25 kilometers per hour. It struck in darkness, without warning, sweeping away everything in its path. Approximately 1,600 people lost their lives in the floods. The majority were not German civilians. More than 1,000 were Soviet prisoners of war and forced labourers held in camps positioned in the valleys below the dams. In the small town of Neheim, some 800 people perished. Nearly 500 of them were Ukrainian women from a labour camp that stood directly in the path of the water. They had been brought to Germany against their will to work in the armaments factories. They had no connection to the war machine they were forced to serve. They simply happened to be sleeping in the wrong valley on the wrong night. This is not a comfortable truth, and for decades it was largely absent from the triumphant narratives surrounding Operation Chastise. The raid was celebrated as a feat of British ingenuity and courage, which it undoubtedly was. The cost paid by innocent victims of Nazi forced labour received rather less attention. History is rarely as clean as the stories we tell about it. The men of 617 Squadron continued flying. The war did not pause to let them mourn. There would be other operations, other targets, other losses. Of the 133 aircrew who had taken off on the night of the 16th of May, only 48 would still be alive when Germany surrendered 2 years later. The Dambusters raid was the most famous night of their lives. For most of them, the years that followed would be measured in months. The immediate impact on German industry was substantial. Steel production across the Ruhr fell by 75% in the weeks following the raid. Coal output dropped by 400,000 tons. Electrical power to the factories was cut for 2 weeks. Water supply to cities and industrial facilities was severely disrupted. For a brief window, the arsenal of the Reich was crippled. But wars are not won by brief windows. The German response was swift and determined. 7,000 workers were diverted from other construction projects to repair the dams, many of them pulled from the Atlantic Wall fortifications that Hitler was building to repel the expected Allied invasion of France. Organisation TOT, the Nazi Construction Corps, treated the reconstruction as an absolute priority. Engineers worked around the clock through the summer months. By September 1943, barely 4 months after the raid, both the Möhne and the Eder were fully repaired and holding water again. Bomber Command did not strike the construction sites during this period, not once. The dams stood open and vulnerable, surrounded by scaffolding and work crews, and no bombs fell on them. The reasons remain debated by historians. Some argue that Harris considered the job done and saw no need for follow-up attacks. Others suggest that the operational difficulties of the original raid made repeat missions impractical. Whatever the explanation, the opportunity was missed. Wallis felt this keenly. He had designed a weapon capable of breaching the most heavily defended dams in Europe, watched it succeed beyond reasonable expectation, and then seen the advantage frittered away through inaction. He spoke of it for the rest of his life, this failure to exploit success. The bouncing bomb had worked. The strategy that should have followed it had not. The honest assessment is this: Operation Chastise was a tactical triumph and a strategic disappointment. The dams were breached, the floods were catastrophic, the industrial disruption was real, but the damage was temporary. The German war economy absorbed the blow and recovered. The Ruhr continued producing steel and weapons until Allied ground forces physically occupied the factories in 1945. Yet to measure the raid purely in industrial statistics is to miss something important. The propaganda value was immense and immediate. Britain had been at war for nearly 4 years, much of that time spent absorbing defeats and retreats. Dunkirk, Singapore, Tobruk. The public was hungry for a victory that demonstrated British ingenuity and daring, something to prove that the nation could strike back at the enemy in spectacular fashion. The Dambusters raid provided exactly that. It was front-page news around the world. It demonstrated that no target in Germany was beyond reach. It reminded the Germans that their homeland was not safe. Air Chief Marshal Harris, who had dismissed Wallis's proposal as tripe of the wildest description, met the engineer shortly after the raid. His assessment had changed somewhat. As he told Wallis directly, "I did not believe a word you said when you came to see me, but now you could sell me a pink elephant." It was, by Harris's standards, an effusive apology. On the 27th of May 1943, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth arrived at RAF Scampton. It was an extraordinary honour reserved for extraordinary achievements. Gibson walked the royal couple through the briefing room, showing them scale models of the dams and reconnaissance photographs of the breached Möhne and Eder, floodwaters still visible across the valleys. The king, himself a former naval officer, spent considerable time speaking with the surviving aircrew, understanding what these men had accomplished. 34 decorations were announced for a single operation, unprecedented in Bomber Command's history. Gibson received the Victoria Cross from the Queen at Buckingham Palace on the 22nd of June. At 24, he became the most highly decorated serviceman in the British Armed Forces, his tunic heavy with ribbons representing missions most men would not survive once. The squadron needed a motto. Someone suggested a phrase attributed to Madame de Pompadour, "Après moi, le déluge." After me, the flood. The double meaning was perfect. Literally, it described what the squadron had done. Metaphorically, it carried a darker edge, a suggestion of consequences unleashed that cannot be recalled. A new crest was designed showing a dam breached by lightning. It remains the squadron's emblem to this day. 617 Squadron became an elite unit, assigned the most difficult targets of the war, and Wallis continued his work. The earthquake bombs he had proposed in 1941 finally entered production. The tall boy weighed 12,000 pounds. The Grand Slam weighed 22,000, the largest bomb of the war. Both penetrated deep into the earth before detonating, collapsing structures from below, rather than simply blasting them from above. In November 1944, 617 Squadron caught the Tirpitz. The German battleship had hidden in Norwegian fjords for years, tying down Royal Navy capital ships simply by existing. Lancasters carrying tall boys found her near Tromsø. 3 direct hits capsized her. The threat that had haunted the Admiralty was eliminated by bombs the Air Ministry had once dismissed as impractical. Gibson did not see this triumph. Withdrawn from operations after the raid, he was sent on a publicity tour of North America. He found the experience uncomfortable and eventually persuaded his superiors to let him return to flying. On the 19th of September 1944, his Mosquito crashed in the Netherlands. He was 26. Wallis outlived him by 35 years. The swing wing concept he had pioneered was considered too ambitious for its era. He lived to see it vindicated in the Panavia tornado, which entered RAF service in 1979. He passed away that October, aged 92, having seen his ideas transform from rejected proposals to operational aircraft. 617 Squadron never disbanded. It transitioned through Canberra's Vulcans tornadoes. In 2018, it became the first British unit to operate the F-35 Lightning. The pilots who fly these aircraft wear the same badge, a dam breached by lightning. They carry the same motto, "After me, the flood."